Good evening, gentlemen. How are you?
Good, Cy. How are you?
Yes, Si. Good evening, Josh. Si.
Good
Happy to
evening,
see
Howard.
both of you.
Likewise, likewise. A pleasure indeed.
I'm getting used to this Wednesday night. It's a nice alternative to the poker game that I would have.
And perhaps either saves you some money or saves you some winnings. Let's put it that way. One way or another, Josh.
Or it may be a poker game, but of a different sort.
I- we will leave that alone, my good friend. Indeed, indeed, indeed. So we are in our third night of exploring the quotes together, and we've all chosen three quotes, and now we'll focus on the three that we have for this evening, and then we'll do a bit of a wrapper. And if people want to learn more about us and about why we're doing this, they can definitely look us up on LinkedIn, and by all means revisit the initial recording.
That sounds great.
Excellent. So,
Very good.
so without too much more to say, Howard, are you good to jump into
Yeah,
your
I'll
quote, my
I'll,
good
uh,
friend?
I'll start out. We've entitled this "Quotes for Life," and tonight is our third and final quote. And I thought for myself, who else but go to Elie Wiesel, who is world renowned for his writings on the Holocaust. And interestingly enough, a friend of ours, Josh and I, this friend of ours actually worked with Elie Wiesel's son at Goldman Sachs. So interesting life he's had, and his writings again are world renowned. And I picked this quote because when we talk about life, who better perhaps to have written about it than someone who has lived such a life that came through the Holocaust and survived and was able to put his thoughts down so well. And my quote is: "The opposite of love is not hate; it's indifference. The opposite of art is not ugliness; it's indifference. The opposite of faith is not heresy; it's indifference. And the opposite of life is not death; it's indifference." And it's so powerful to me, the words on paper. We talk about such important things as love, art, faith, and actually life itself. And from a man who lived through such an experience, it's quite powerful for him to be saying that the most important opposite of all these things is indifference. And he saw it firsthand that all these things have such meaning to human life. Loving each other and the art that we do and the faith that we have and the life that we live. But in his view, the most important opposite of those things is indifference to those things itself, indifference to life, faith, art, and love. And it just strikes a chord with me that on this last night of our quotes for life, I wanted to talk about this quote. Thank you.
Very powerful. Thank you. Very powerful. Josh, any thoughts, my good friend, to chime in?
Yeah, I've got a few hundred thoughts on this one actually. No, I'm just kidding.
All good.
Um, Howard, don't give up that secret. Um, I it, it, it when Elie Wiesel writes about indifference, as Howard was done because he was a Holocaust survivor. The in indifference is sort of the is sort of the final fig leaf in that regard, because what it's saying to us in essence is that if you don't care, if you don't care, then you cease to be human.
Hmm.
That's why the Holocaust happened. People forgot about their basic humanity, about
Yep.
what it is that makes us human. And the only way that anything can flourish, whether it's human life and the things that are an extension of each of our lives, both individually and collectively, is that we care.
Yep.
And when there's indifference, anything can and likely will happen. It sort of reminds me of some other quotes that are tangent that bear a relationship to that. It was the 18th century philosopher Edmund Burke who wrote that who wrote that um, let's see if I'm all that is required for evil to triumph is for men of goodwill to do nothing.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
If we're just going to be bystanders, we're just existing, we're not living,
Yep.
and nothing is capable of flourishing.
Yep.
When the first statement gets made that the opposite of love isn't hate, it's indifference. Why is that the case? Now Wiesel just makes the statement, but he doesn't explain it. However, the explanation to me is readily apparent because, frankly, as I was thinking about this and said to somebody the other day about this was something I had thought of. I didn't even know Elie Wiesel had said that.
Mm-hmm.
Because for me, in the course of all the vicissitudes of my life, it led me to conclude that the opposite of love isn't hate but indifference. And why is that? Because love and hate have a number of things in common.
Yep.
They are our two most visceral emotions.
Right.
And if you love or hate someone, or you love or hate an idea, they both have extraordinary impact upon your life. One may be a positive impact, the other a negative impact, but they both have extraordinary impact. When so love and hate have a number of things in common.
Mm-hmm.
When someone doesn't matter, when someone's not, the indifference is the opposite of love, because in that instance the person means nothing to them.
Yep.
Their
Right.
existence means nothing. They're not even a speck on their emotional map. And the same is true for everything else, because everything else, whether it's art, whether it's faith, whatever it is, all these things are an extension of who we are.
Mm-hmm.
But if we're indifferent, we're basically nothing.
Yeah.
Yep. I agree.
Yeah. So, so it's powerful because it sets up the paradox, and it's an and. We can't, exactly to both of your points. Indifference doesn't take a stance, if you will. Anything goes, and exactly as the key word being care. If once we stop caring, we cease to be human. Exactly as Josh you mentioned, and the question that this poses for me, and I want to kind of have you both sort of speak into it, is of all there's indifference all around us today. So what would we say to one another in the world that we find ourselves today, Howard and Josh?
I'll say, to me, another reason this is so important is um, we don't want history to repeat itself.
Mm-hmm.
And of course, we see indifference. There's still war. After the World War II, the war that hopefully would have ended all wars, we're still seeing indifference. And we see horrible things. And just this past weekend, I was up in Providence, Rhode Island, visiting my son. And I took an Uber that happened to be driven by a Kurd from Syria. And he was talking about the indifference that forced him out of his country, that he's here now and trying to get his family out of Syria. And it just struck me that this is still true. These words are still true today.
Yeah. At a society level, within organizations, within relationships, I mean, any scale that we think about, they're present.
Well, it goes to the whole idea of how we conduct our lives. It's the dismissiveness.
Mm-hmm.
It's a somewhat different word, but it really ties in with indifference. If you dismiss somebody, it's your way of saying that person doesn't count.
Yep.
So it's not indifference on both sides of the equation. It's an indifference to one side of the equation. But once you do that, it ceases to be an equation.
Yeah.
It's only when you're willing to deal with the other side
Yep. Yep.
that you can that you have a certain that there is a certain that you attach to every endeavor a
Yep.
certain degree of intellectual rigor and probity. And that's what's really lacking, because what's happening in our society is that when it's governed by ideology and not by the intellect,
Mm-hmm.
which can be its own discussion, ideology versus
Yeah. Oh
intellect,
yeah. Yeah.
because people tend to think they're one and the same, and they're not. They actually are opposites of one another. But that's another discussion for another time. But that being said, once you dismiss the person, you don't have to deal with the argument.
Yep.
That's what's going on in our society today.
Yeah.
As a result of that, there's no real dialogue. There's no real dialogue. And without that dialogue, you can't learn from what's going on right now, and you
Mm-hmm.
can't learn from the past.
Yeah.
Right.
And
And
we
so
Right.
risk
when I
repeating
use
history.
Hegel's quote from the second podcast, that the owl of Minerva spreads his wings only at the gathering of the dusk, here's a perfect example of the society we now live under, in which we are living out Hegel's nightmare.
Mm-hmm.
The idea that there's so much we can learn from the past and need to learn from the past, and yet we either don't, or when we do, we learn those lessons too
Yeah.
late for them to be meaningful.
Yeah. Yeah. The power of the word indifference is for us to shy away and for us to shy away and not embrace the many paradoxes of life, where in a paradox it's the and not the or that integrates those sides and really begins to express that care. And it's a very, very, we risk, I think Howard, you said it perfectly. I think Howard or one of you said it. We risk repeating the mistakes of the past, and some of those
Right.
mistakes to repeat them is beyond us. I mean, truly beyond our exist. We would be jeopardizing our sheer existence as a society
Well,
and a human race.
that's when I hate to use the pedestrian term. That's when people become stupid. But
Yeah.
it sort of reminds me of the great line from Aristophanes, who wrote that ignorance can be educated, drunkenness sobered, but stupid lasts forever. And it lasts forever when you create an environment in which only certain ideas and views can be countenanced.
Yeah.
Only certain things can be discussed.
Yeah.
And once you lose that sense of the idea that, as we say in Latin, nullius in verba, that no man's word shall be final.
Yeah.
That's when stupidity reigns, and that lasts forever. And when you have that, you have a society that is going to be mired in an abyss that increasingly it will not be able to extricate itself from.
Well said.
Yeah.
Howard, thank you for the quote. Anything to add, Howard, before we move on to the
No,
gentleman?
no. I like the input, and again, I'm glad that I chose this quote specifically for
Me
tonight.
too.
Thank you, my friend. Josh, my good friend.
Well, this third one is from the great German philosopher Immanuel Kant, who in his groundwork on the metaphysics of morals, which he wrote in the 1780s, he wrote one of the statements he wrote has always stuck with me, which is that virtue is the moral disposition in conflict. And it's one of those themes. It's been a running theme for me for years. It's not just about virtue, because first of all, you take the statement right on its surface. Virtue is the moral disposition in conflict. It sounds like a relatively simple statement, sort of like Aristotle's statement that all men have a desire to know. But it isn't until you start to get into the weeds that you realize there's nothing simple about it. Why?
Mm-hmm.
Because it not only says something, but it engenders a host of questions. Questions, again, as I've said in the previous podcast, are the most important tool by which we learn anything in life. In the absence of asking questions, you don't learn anything. It doesn't matter what tools you have at your disposal, because you'll never use them.
Yep.
And so it begs the question, What is virtue?
Hmm.
What's the moral disposition? What does conflict mean in the context of both of those? But we don't even think of ourselves. We don't even think of the concept of virtue. We think that that's become an historical anachronism.
Hmm.
Oh, that's what folks talked about 2,300 years ago. But the fact is, it's not the case. It speaks to what the whole philosophical enterprise was supposed to be about, which is about conflict. It's
Yep.
about struggle. It's about wrestling with ideas. It's about wrestling with who we are, with our better angels versus our lesser angels. And out of that conflict, out of the quarrel with ourselves, we make poetry, as I mentioned William Butler Yeats having written. And that's really the running theme in how I've looked at what's wrong with the world in the last 35, 40 years and where we sort of gone. And why Kant is such an important moral philosopher for me, because it also speaks to, I apologize for the jargon. Kant's moral philosophy is really what we call a deontological
Hmm.
normative theory, in
Hmm.
the sense that in the sense that for Kant, the idea of being a more of a great moral being is about the intent of one's actions,
Yep.
versus the more utilitarian ethic that was associated with, let's say, Jeremy Bentham or John Stuart Mill, two great British thinkers from the early 19th century. Although Mill later amends some of that utilitarian ethic, but the idea that, oh, it's just about the results, right? We talked about the journey versus the
Hmm.
destiny. For
Hmm.
Kant, it's entirely about the journey. It's about our intent.
Yep.
We know that the results aren't always going to be great because we're human, but the importance is in knowing, first of all, that in order for our actions as human beings to be intelligible, there has to be a moral dimension
Yep.
that's associated with it. If not for that, how are we any different than any other living species?
Yep.
How can we claim to be the higher order of species? How can we claim to be more than just species who are governed by their instincts? We lose all the ground in that regard unless we are cognizant of the moral dimension, which suffuses our actions and our lives with meaning.
Beautifully said.
Yeah.
Howard, my good friend, please chime
Well,
in.
it's going to be tough to follow Josh,
All good. All
but
good.
the way I read this is very similar to the way I read the Elie Wiesel quote. We need that moral component in our conflicts, and if we lack them, to me, it's almost the same message that Elie Wiesel is saying. There's indifference without that moral component, and the way I read it again is any conflict we need morality, and we
Hmm.
need to be able to, and when you lack that, then you have that indifference, and if you have indifference, horrible things can happen and
Yeah.
have.
Yeah. The parallels. This is very much in the same vein that Howard you added to exactly the rendition, Josh, that you shared. The parallels between the two quotes is pretty powerful. If we look at, I mentioned the word paradox. If we look at conflict in this case, that is dealing with paradox. And Howard, forgive me, Josh, you mentioned the word struggle. It is definitively a struggle, exactly as Howard you mentioned, relative to the indifference and the virtue, as I like to call it. And this is not my words. This actually has another source. Taking whole. That's the greatest virtue to deal with conflict or paradox through the struggle. And that comes off in both quotes. The moral disposition is not to have indifference. It's a there's very powerful parallels between the quotes. So extremely eloquent
It
quotes.
it, it, it is, and I would also add the virtue component. We have failed to realize, and even various contemporary thinkers have recognized the fact, even going back to the founding fathers, that in order for a republic, which we are here in the United States, however imperfect, and by its nature it would have to be imperfect, in order for that to work, you need virtuous people to be occupying the seats of power so that they can exercise power properly, that they don't exercise power for the sake of power's sake, but for the greater good. It has such wholesale implications, because when Kant speaks, when Hegel writes, and this is part of the reason why I cited them, Cy and Howard, is because that's part of the whole enterprise. Not just a contemporary dialogue, but what made the philosophical enterprise so great, which has changed in the last 50 years, where it's become much more of a linguistic exercise, is the fact that all the great philosophers across the centuries addressed all the fundamental concerns that were originally promulgated by Plato. It's about first principles. It's about asking the fundamental questions of human life. What is it that makes us human? What constitutes a virtue? And from that, what are those virtues? So Howard mentions in the quote from Elie Wiesel about Wiesel's concern about indifference. A virtuous person could never be indifferent about anything, about themselves or about the world around them. And how does one immerse themselves in the conflict or the struggle? By having courage. As Aristotle noted, courage was the first virtue because it's from that virtue that all the others flow. And it was from the virtues. It was the virtuous person who exemplified happiness. So that even the way in which we define happiness today, which tends to be in the more hedonistic sense, is radically different than how it was defined by our ancestors and predecessors. Because they defined happiness as the result of one who has acquired the intellectual and moral virtues throughout the course of their life. And we've lost that sense of it. And I hope maybe someday, somehow, we'll be able to recapture it.
Very, very well said. So I want to pose a question to Howard. I don't know if you had anything else to chime in. I'd like to pose a bit of a question if you're good. So as you look at the quotes so far, there's a grounding that is taking us to the essence of our humanity. I mean, and we continue to truly the essence of our humanity, both professionally and personally. So if we look at these quotes for life, they are truly a reminder of our own humanity.
Yeah.
Absolutely. That's what it's supposed to be.
And the key word that I would say I'm almost emphasizing is reminder. So if nothing else, we pass on to future generations the gentle reminder not to forget the humanity that we in our current time might have forgotten, for no judgment, just the reality of the situations we find ourselves.
Yeah.
And and that's part of the reason why you mentioned the word relationships before. That's why relationships aren't emphasized any longer.
Yeah.
How we conduct our business tends to be more transactional rather than relational. And as a result, we don't even have the sense of time. That in itself, the concept of time would constitute its own masterclass.
Yeah.
Both in terms of the physical universe as well as the metaphysical.
Yeah, I was going to say, especially from Kant's perspective as well. Exactly. To your
from
speaking
Kant's
of that,
perspective,
in particular, among others,
and that of Henri Bergson and his distinguishing between between time and duration, which actually greatly influenced Einstein's work when he does the special theory of relativity.
Yes, forgive me, I digressed. My apologies, Josh, for interrupting you.
No, that's okay. and it led me to run with the digression. So
all good. All good.
and so as a result of, you know, focusing on the transactional, we lose that we have that sense that time almost doesn't matter. It's
Yeah.
like we get something done, we move on to the next thing. There's that absence of thought and reflection that gifts that we were given,
Yep.
that we are squandering, and we do so at our own risk, individually and collectively.
Yeah.
And the longer we do it, the more difficult it will be to retrieve it. And that's what the past teaches us.
Yeah.
That's the importance of the past, is in learning who we were,
Yep.
so that we can have a greater understanding of what and who we can truly be.
Yeah.
Right.
We
Yeah.
don't have that
Yep.
sense of greatness. You know, I still remember Robert Browning once writing, "A man's reach should exceed his grasp." Well, what is
Yeah.
the heavens for? And there is no sense of that reaching and grasping for something greater. It's always about having to level the playing field.
Yeah. So
That takes no account in the end of our different talents, our different abilities, and our different temperaments. All the things that make us unique, unduplicatable human beings,
yeah.
which is the only reason for grieving when somebody dies.
Yep.
Because when that person dies, that person is always gone. There won't be another that
Yes.
person.
This anchors us directly back in the Herman Hesse quote that launched us all the way on the title of the
Right.
slides we've been using. So definitively. Anything else to add, Howard, relative to this, or Josh,
No,
before I
no,
move
I'm
on to
good.
the third one?
I'm good.
Howard, Howard's good. Josh, you're good.
Yes.
Beautiful, beautiful. So, so the my third quote, if you will, is this one, and this one strikes very deeply, and it has a lot of connection, of course, to quotes that both of you have used already. Howard's in particular this evening and the first evening, and likewise, Josh, likewise on the previous events. So, what is to give light must endure burning, uh, by Viktor Frankl. And Howard, forgive me, Josh, you already mentioned the word that really strikes deeply was the word struggle. Uh, he struggled, and what he emphasized is the endurance. If it's not a question of if there is a struggle, the question is of endurance. And we must endure burning in order to give light. It's not easy for any of us to talk about these quotes because it does put us through a journey in the conversation together.
It does, and his use of the word burning is, I find, really significant, Cy,
Yes.
given what Viktor Frankl himself went through,
Yes.
having gone through a similar experience that Elie Wiesel had gone through.
Yeah, exactly. Exactly. So the ability to endure the burning and give light is so deeply profound and rooted in the humanity, and it also is the lesson that we shouldn't repeat the mistakes of the past very deeply. So
Well, it's
yes.
yeah, because it speaks to, and I'm just, you know, this I think, and I don't know, comes from a great work that Viktor Frankl wrote in the aftermath of the Holocaust, called
Yep.
Man's Search for Meaning.
Yep. Yep.
Okay.
Yeah,
I'm very
it's the
familiar with
definite
the
sort.
work.
Yeah.
So
Yeah.
as a matter of fact, so much so, I gave this work to my daughter to read
Yeah.
after after my wife, her incredible mother, died 4 years ago.
Condolences, dear friend.
And and the word burning has significance given where he came from, having been witness to his entire family being wiped out during the Holocaust, and being truly alone in the most literal sense and then wondering to himself, what do I do? What do I do with my life? How can I even fashion a life? I've just been witness to something that was and still is unfathomable.
Yeah.
What do I do with that? And that's the struggle to find meaning
Yep.
within ourselves. And in order to do that, we have to confront ourselves. We are engaged in a struggle. We either are, and this is so perfect for the cultural zeitgeist that we're going through right now,
Mm-hmm.
guys, because right now we're witnessing the culture war isn't so much about pro-life, pro-choice. It is the battleground is
Yep.
between two things, as I see it, between the oppressed, how it's being fashioned, between the oppressed and the oppressor. And that to me says something about how each side looks at the past.
Mm-hmm.
The oppressed, or those who argue that they're oppressed, want to basically eliminate the past. They say, "Oh, to use the vernacular, the past sucks.
Mm-hmm.
So let's just get rid of that. Let's pretend that didn't exist, and let's just take this Whiggish view that everything that's going to happen from now on is just going to ineluctably make us better. Just with the passage of
Yep.
time,
Yep.
we'll know more, and we'll be more, as if it just happens." But Viktor Frankl was saying it doesn't happen like that.
Exactly.
It can't happen like that. We are left with our wits about us. So it becomes a matter of, oh, there's the oppressed and there's the survivor.
Yep.
Viktor Frankl was a survivor. He's
Yep.
the antithesis
Yes.
of the prevalent culture that exists today. The one that says, I'm oppressed, the past stinks, let's get rid of it. The other side, the survivor, says, we can't ignore the past. There were great things in the past, and there were things wrong that came out of the past.
Yep.
What do we do with that? We learn from it.
Yep.
And then we take what we learn and we apply it. We have to accept the fact we're not always going to get dealt a great hand, but we do the best we can with the hand that we're dealt, without whatever wits we have about us. And that's what Viktor Frankl,
Yeah.
in his whole work on logotherapy,
Yep.
the
Yep.
Aryan psychology that he
Yep.
pioneered, that's really what it's all about.
So Josh, I don't want to lose, and Howard, I definitely want you to chime in, but Josh, I
Yeah.
don't want to lose something that's very crucial relative to the quote and relative to the historical context, the modern historical context in which you painted the picture. What to endure burning, you must endure burning in order to give light. Power is rooted in the enduring of the burning. If you don't endure the burning, you cannot give light. And that may seem like a very blunt statement, but it's so real and goes to the core of everything we're saying and the contextual time that you placed it in. So thank you for that eloquent description.
Sure.
Thank
You're
you.
welcome.
Howard, my good man,
Yeah,
your voice,
it's
please.
interesting. I mean, certainly everything both of you have said is so meaningful. When I first saw this, I thought about life itself, and I said, when I was traveled, and I've traveled quite a lot. I happened to have been in California with the redwoods, and I'm not sure either one of you are aware of it, but they need fire to survive.
Yep.
They have a component in their wood that is fireproof, but the fire is necessary for them to clear the ground beneath them and to reproduce. And they actually have learned that they need to burn these trees to some extent to enable them to survive for the future.
I didn't know that.
Yeah.
Yeah.
That's fascinating.
So when I saw this, and I know the historical context as well, but when I saw that endure burning, I also thought about how certain aspects, if we could take what Mother Nature has given us, that if the trees, these certain trees, they need that burning to survive. I saw it as something similar that in our lives, and I've said it to Josh, maybe I've said it to you, Cy. My father used to say a hard beginning, an easy end.
Yep.
And I also see that in there, that we have to go through that difficult beginning.
Yeah.
And it will give us the light. So
Yeah.
I look at that, and in my own life, the examples that I could, um, think about in terms of that struggle. I think of those two things, what my father had said, and also the fact that some things in life require burning
Yeah.
to give life and to live and to go forward.
Howard, your reference, if you will, is very key. And I know, Howard, you're aware of my work in anti-fragility. I can't remember, Josh, if we've talked about it. Nassim Taleb's work, and I use anti-fragility to help organizations and individuals really grow and change. And one of the key elements is stress. Stress becomes a force, if you will, that helps them endure burning, not to the degree that they pass on, but rather the right dosage in order for us to achieve growth. So I grow in the process, respectfully, others grow in the process of the application of stress. And most definitively, it's about ecosystems, it's about how organizations grow, exactly as Howard you mentioned.
Right.
And I want to pose this as a question, and really we have almost sanitized how we think about death, that we look at it we've sanitized it to the degree that we don't recognize there has to be micro moments of death within us in order for new things to flourish. And it's and that micro death is an enduring of something burning, which then
Right.
gives light to something greater.
Yeah, there is something to be said for that. I think that you use the term fragility, and that to me that ties in very much with what we've been talking about this evening, because it is only when we recognize how fragile we are
Yes.
that we come to grips not just with life's finitude, but with the meaning that we need to try to develop and to then convey and pass on to others. In the absence of those things, there isn't that sense of moral urgency,
Yeah.
that sense of caring, and that leads to indifference. It
Yeah.
leads to not only the need not to struggle, but the aversion to struggling.
Yes.
Yeah. And
And
Cy,
that's where
sorry, Josh.
and that's where we have really essentially crippled ourselves to a greater or lesser extent. Those who lived before us were very conscious of their own flaws,
Yeah.
their own
Yeah.
foibles, their own
Yeah.
idiosyncrasies,
Their mortality.
because that's what makes us human.
Yeah.
And we tend to spend too much time quantifying things. So I recall, so I live by the statement because I've been through certain medical
Yeah.
issues myself, where I've come to the realization, which I didn't have as a kid, that at least for me, life is to be judged not so much by how many breaths we take,
Yep.
but by how many times our breath has been taken away from us.
Yes. Yes.
But it's only by having that sense of the finitude of our lives, that sense of the fragility of life,
Yeah.
of the things and the people who matter most to us. Because it's only by coming to grips with the importance of those ideas and
Yep.
of those people, that we will then endeavor to nurture and cultivate them. In the absence of that,
Yep.
and just taking things for granted, they all will wither away,
Yeah.
and we will have nothing, and we will be nothing.
Yes. Howard, I know you wanted to say
Oh,
something.
say one quick thing.
Yeah, please.
What you touched on about our mortality, and I was saying to you, and I've said it to both of you, I had a situation where I lost a good friend from COVID.
Yep.
And it was in an organization that the request went out to not to say anything about this person's passing. He was a member of our team for 6 years. And we went on a call with about 50 people, and we weren't allowed to say a thing. And it was such a, and I'll use the term, the indifference,
Mm-hmm.
regardless of the reason why, was so stark. And people were calling me saying, "I can't believe that we're not recognizing this person's passing." But we were told not to discuss his passing.
It's startling to me, but I do think, Howard, I'll be honest, I do think the reason does matter. I think it's important for us to try to understand
Yep.
why that's become so prevalent, why
Yep.
people think it's
Yep.
appropriate, why they think it's good
Right.
not
Yeah.
to say not to say anything, because in the end it's about that we're caught in the grips of being afraid,
Yep.
Yes.
of being of confronting certain truths
Right.
Yep.
about ourselves and the world around us, that that we shun, that we're too afraid to deal with.
Yep.
That's part of the reason why, as I mentioned, why why um why we don't ask questions,
Mm-hmm.
because in many instances people are afraid of what the answer is
Yeah.
going to be,
Right.
that it's
Yeah.
going to
Right.
take them out of their comfort zone.
Yep.
But the whole idea is to learn how to be comfortable with being uncomfortable.
Exactly.
Yep. I agree.
Exactly. So I wanna add in, because there's something that is very, very keen that we're honing in on, especially around this point at this juncture. And I've shared this with Howard. I know Howard, you and I have had more intimate
Right.
conversations around this than perhaps Josh, you and I have had at this point. But my passing 3 times, completely flatlining,
Yeah.
dying 3 times and come back, it has liberated me in ways that is more profound than anything. That that engagement with death helps me recognize the awe, the wonder of what life is, and now I can live it. And it is a
Yes.
profound liberation. And it's sad, it's very sad when we we take away the opportunity in a healthy way for us all to deal with that reality, that existential crisis. The
Yes.
closest thing I'll say in recent years that has come close to this is the COVID experience. Most people have not experienced that degree of confronting life and death in that way.
Correct.
Some have awoken respectfully. Some have even sunk deeper into their slumber respectfully. We live in very interesting time, gentlemen.
Yes.
we we
Yeah.
we
I
we, we
agree.
we do. It's a lot of it, again, is about the concept of victimhood has so permeated our environment, almost to the point where it's worn as a badge of honor.
Yeah.
And when you play that part, two things happen, both of which are lousy. One is that you you never grow.
Yep.
You never accept responsibility for your own actions. It's always somebody else's fault or something else beyond your control. And
Yep.
the other part of it is, I've always been of the view, and I'm reminded of somebody who I interviewed years ago to come work for me, is that if you play the victim card, you forfeit the right to claim to be anybody's equal.
Exactly.
Because if you were if you were as smart as everybody else, why is it you never see the punch coming?
Yep.
Why are you always getting the short end of the stick? Why are you always having to pick yourself up?
Yeah.
All these things tied together, sometimes directly, sometimes more tangentially or obliquely, but nevertheless, they all are of a piece. They all bear a relationship to one another to a
Yes, they
greater
do.
or lesser extent, directly or indirectly.
Anything else to add, Howard or Josh, relative to this?
No, I
Anything
mean,
at all?
I'm ready if we want to talk about our interrelationship with our other quotes.
Excellent.
Um, Maybe
E-
a good segue.
Excellent.
Yeah.
Excellent. Um, let Howard. These are the three, my good friend,
Yes,
and
and
please share your thoughts.
again, and I've learned myself. I always said there's always something new to learn, and I've learned so much from the two of you and the dialogue we've had. I thank you both. Um, but when my first quote from Heschel, talking about what am I here for? That's the one question that encompasses everything. And then looking at the next quote saying, "There's only one man, and only one man ever understood me, and he didn't understand me." That's yourself. And then finally talking about this indifference and in the I like Josh's interpretation of the equation aspect of it, and to me they all tie together. What am I here for? How do I understand myself? These, the constant struggle to look at life and make meaning of it, even especially as you said in this world of COVID, where we've seen so many young, healthy people, including my friends who have passed at such a young age with so much to give. You question, why we're here, and this, So to me, my three quotes um, do tie together, and this discussion has made me a better person, be understanding and
Well,
probing some of the things we've done on these podcasts.
Thank you, Howard. Thank you ever so much, Josh. Anything to chime in on, my friend?
yeah. The first thing I want to say is, having been a part of these three discussions and doing it with the two of you, uh, you know, just confirms for me what is so utterly lacking in our world today, and what we need to recapture. The whole idea of being able to have a meaningful exchange of ideas amongst three people who care about one another,
Hmm.
who who care about the importance of ideas, and who know how to love, who know how to be a part of something that's larger than themselves,
Yeah,
and that they understand that as T.S. Eliot wrote, that the giving famishes the craving,
Hmm.
and that when you give to others, you're also giving to yourself.
Yeah.
The three quotes that I chose is not the common thread there for me, and how they are inextricably tied to one another is in a number of ways, but for me in two significant ways. One is that all three of them are philosophers,
Hmm.
three of the greatest philosophers in the history of Western thought. Why did I choose them? I chose Plato first because he was the first of the great philosophers. As Alfred North Whitehead, a great 20th century philosopher in his own right, had said, there is Plato, and everyone else who follows him is a footnote. And leaving aside his somewhat hyperbolic statement, though I get where he was going with that. What Hegel and Kant and other great philosophers all have in common was the fact that they understood the importance of having that great exchange of ideas and having that exchange of ideas across the centuries. A dialogue that no longer exists
Yep.
in the contemporary world, but a dialogue that had existed for over 2,000 years. It's not altogether dissimilar from the Talmud, the great ancient texts that were created between the first and the sixth century CE, where even in the construction of those texts, where the great rabbinic sages are arguing with one another, it's structured in such a way as if all those rabbis are sitting in somebody's living room
Yep.
having this great discussion with one another, when in fact they're having that dialogue across the centuries, just as the great philosophers have. So it's the importance of having that dialogue so that we can truly share with one another who we are and what we want to represent. It leads me ineluctably to the great statement from the Book of Solomon, in which he writes, "As I learn without guile, I impart without envy. I do not hide her riches." Share what you know and share who you are. If you do those two things in life, your life will have had great meaning.
Hmm.
And the other part that I'll leave you with is the importance of studying the past. As Alexis de Tocqueville said, the only way to understand ourselves and as a people is by understanding our birth, by understanding our origins. They all recognize that. So that truth, while not historicist, is still historical. And the importance of being able to go back and understand our roots, where we came from, will allow us to better direct us as to where we're going to go.
Excellent. Howard, anything relative to Josh's sharing?
No, again, I learned so much just from that dialogue and listening to Josh and yourself, and
As have
no,
I.
I'm just so happy I was able to participate.
Thank you both.
That's
Thank you
all.
both. So, so you've got my three, which we have definitively discussed, and I want to kind of weave a little bit into the thought around the rendition of them as a whole. I think you both know me well enough. I'm very pragmatic, excessively pragmatic. Um, and I'm very keen on on really dealing with reality, human nature, and who we are individually, collectively, our identities, our culture, if you will.
Right.
A lot of people, to be very, very frank about this, a lot of people will look at what we've gone through and say, well, these are platitudes. What I say is, these are not platitudes. These all have impact and translate to immediate practice in our everyday life. I've heard this statement, especially in the current situations. These things that we do are peer reviewed, they like to say, as if peer review justifies whatever someone may be saying nowadays. And the reality is, exactly, all you're saying is, I fit in. It doesn't do much for you to say peer reviewed. So, with that backdrop of pragmatism to the core, the first quote is very much about soul and creation. And there's so much talk today about purpose and finding your purpose, when we really should be acknowledging we have a soul. We have the opportunity to give it form in this life. We are creators, and we should be in search of what feeds that creation and our soul. It can be extremely empowering. Looking and integrating that into the second quote, it's very much about renewal and regeneration and the reminder that we are alive. So many people talk about, well, this is what I want, or this is what I need, or exactly as what we've discussed, I'm the victim. But there's so little talk about what I'm willing to give, exactly as we've talked about. What am I willing to sacrifice in order to seize the opportunity of this gift called life? And nothing is owed to anyone. And the second quote is a genuine reminder to renew, regenerate, refresh in our journey to create our souls. And then the third one is really the key word of the evening around struggle and endurance. Very, very deep quote. There's so much talk about avoiding hardship, right? Everybody respectfully is looking for the easy way out, as if hardship is a punishment, when the reality is anyone who has achieved anything in giving of themselves and have had a great impact in history and the world has endured a struggle, endured a burning, and has been able to give light. A struggle so deep, as expressed in that last quote, that it burns and gives light.
I love what you just said. So
You're far too kind, my man.
no, and I mean that in the fullest sense of the word, because because out of that struggle comes who we are.
Yeah.
Because how we struggle is the reflection of who we are. And to use something which I know this will be a great example for Howard, because Howard is an incredible lover of the physical universe, and tremendously knowledgeable of it, and has and often makes, will incorporate some of that into discussions we're having, which is always great. So here you're talking about struggle, Cy, and it reminded me of something. And Howard certainly knows this as well, if not better than I do, because he knows way more about that stuff than I do. Which was a statement John Kennedy made at the beginning of the, at the harbinger of the space program, when he said, we're not doing these things because they're easy.
Right.
We're doing these things
Yeah.
because they're hard.
Yeah.
Right.
And if I can add, Josh, to when you look at these three quotes that I've chosen and the summary statement for me and the guidance, if you will, that I pass on. I mean, we've all passed on so much. We must endure, struggle and burn to give light, and regenerate, living the gift of life as we create ourselves. And so many people respectfully are not taking the opportunity to
Well,
create
yeah,
themselves.
I agree. Doesn't that, it reminds me, of Camus' great essay, The Myth of Sisyphus. What do we learn from Sisyphus? He continually pushes the rock up the hill, only to have it constantly fall back down.
Yep.
But instead of taking the view that that it's merely futile, Camus was saying that the testimony to man's greatness doesn't reside in whether we succeed. The testimony to our greatness is in our willingness to struggle.
Yes. Gentlemen, I am forever grateful to both of you for the
Well, I'm
opportunity
incredibly
to have
grateful to
shared
both
this
of you, and
experience.
I'm incredibly grateful to Howard for more reasons than time will permit here for me to mention. But to add one to the already large list of the eternal gratitudes that I owe Howard is his enlisting me in this endeavor.
He brought us together.
And so,
Exactly.
I mean,
Exactly,
now
gentlemen.
that we've been enlightened by all of us, but Josh especially, you can see why I thought he'd be the perfect guy for this.
Definitely. So I think we, and correct me, gentlemen, if I'm misspeaking, we extend the invitation and we encourage people to think about what are their three quotes for life.
Absolutely.
Yes.
And if they are interested, right, and we do extend the invitation to have a conversation around those three quotes, very much as we did. And
Yeah.
the wisdom it could reveal, and the learnings and the sharings, and I'll say the brotherhood it encompasses, and the sisterhood it encompasses, and the humanity that it brings forward.
Agreed. If we're able to accomplish that on any level, I can't imagine anything anything greater that I will have achieved in my life, other than the love of my children, and of my and of my and of those incredibly close friendships that mean everything to me.
Beautiful. Howard, my good friend, anything before we sign off?
No, and to Josh's point, I was grateful to witness his son getting married.
Mm.
Beautiful.
2 days later, I was grateful to see another marriage. 2 days apart, 2 days, two marriages. And we talk about creation. I'll just say one last thing. It reminded me of my own marriage when the rabbi was a very intellectual gentleman. He said, we buy a house, we create a home, and then we create a family. But I love that distinction that a home is just a physical structure. I mean, the house is. I mean, the home is the physical. The house is where we live. Or did I say that wrong? I
All
said,
good.
yeah, that the house is the physical. The home is
Yep.
what we build. I'm sorry,
All
it's
good.
late.
All good. All good, my
But
friend.
that to me is in creating the home with my wife and my family, and watching these two young couples get married was very meaningful as well.
Thank you for that, Howard, and I know how meaningful it was for my kids to have you, for my son to have you there to share in that, and not to put too fine a point on it, but you have two incredibly great kids
Thank
I
you.
know and who I love, and yes, there's always an element of luck that comes into play for the good things that happen to us in life, for which,
Right.
but uh, but you
I
and
think we're
you and
losing
your
Josh.
wife
Yeah.
deserve an enormous amount of credit for that. The two of you are largely responsible for how incredibly wonderful those two children are. Leaving
Thank you.
aside their talents, their character is what separates them from most other children today,
Yeah.
and it's
Thank
very
you.
rare to be witness to two children who conduct themselves in the manner in which they do, and you and your wife deserve
Yeah.
an enormous, an unquantifiable amount of credit for that.
Thank you.
Beautiful. Josh, you may want to check your power. We don't want to lose you,
Right.
especially
We lost you for a second. You
for
went
a
dark.
second. Yeah, but we don't want to lose you for us. And anything else to add, Josh, as a final note before we sign off, my good friend? You good, Josh?
I think we lost him. Maybe he doesn't hear us.
Maybe he doesn't.
Did I lose you guys? I
No, can you
can't
No.
hear
hear
us?
you.
Can you hear us, Josh?
I think there's some
We might have
connectivity.
lost him.
Yeah.
Okay. Okay. Hopefully, we'll get him back here in a minute.
Oh, yeah.
So likewise, I was hoping Josh would be here. The only thing I ask is you got to promise me, Howard, you got to promise me, Josh, you will never, ever forget how special you are in the world. And if you ever need a gentle reminder, just let me know.
Thank you. Thank you. And the same sign.
Thank you. Thank you both, and thank you for those that are joining and listening. And by all means, we encourage everyone to think about the quotes for life. Thank you, gentlemen.
Thank you. Good night.